Lying down over here.
Yeah. All right, well, let me pray for us, and we will get into our material for the evening. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you again, for your word, for the richness of faith we can have through the study of your word, through meditating upon it, memorizing it, practicing it. And we just pray that you would help us to understand your word and your ways better through our time this evening. We believe that you have a purpose for our lives, that you have great work for us to do, and we pray that we would be better equipped to accomplish the deeds that you have put before us, to perform them, to complete them, so that you may be glorified and honored. And that is our goal, your glory, your honor, your majesty, so that people that we encounter will understand how great you are. And we pray that we would be adequate vehicles in your tools in your hand for the accomplishment of your glory. Thank you again for just the rich blessing of your word. May it dwell richly in us this evening. In Jesus' name. I got my own little, because a lot of what we're doing here is based on my own personal statement of faith that I put together, and I wanted to give you a little bit of a kind of my testimony of my statement of faith, not my testimony about myself, but my last year at seminary, they're getting ready to, they want to kick you out the door, they want to get you out and get new blood in. So they're telling you what you need to do. You need to start sending out resumes, and you need to put together a resume, a doctrinal statement, and all these kinds of things. They gave us examples. I had other examples that I had procured from other places. And I looked through some of these statements of faith, or doctrinal statements, whatever you want to call it, that these people had put together, guys going out there and looking for ministry positions. And I noticed a couple things that I thought were kind of odd, and that's what motivated me to do the statement of faith the way I did it, and that's what kind of motivates our little study here about foundational or essential doctrines and practices. One thing that I noticed is that some of these doctrinal statements were enormous. I mean, they were like 100 and 110 pages long. They were, and you were going to give this to your deacon, board chairman, and expect him to know what in the world to do with it. I think it would open up a door. You could prop open the window or something like that. But, I mean, these were very long and very thorough statements of faith.
Wow.
You know what? If I want a systematic theology, I'm going to buy a systematic theology book from any one of a dozen authors that But so I noticed that. I noticed also that what they would do is that they would present their beliefs systematically. And you all know what systematic theology, you got your everything I believe about bibliology or theology proper, and then Christology and da-da-da-da. So with one of these, theology proper was the first thing, and you flip it open, and by page 2 or page 3, you're in all kinds of obscure, superlapsarianism and hyper, super duper electionism, and you're on page 3 and page 4, and you're thinking, come on, we need to be, we need to be thinking better than this. The other thing that I noticed, and this is not going to be a big surprise to you, I've beat you over the head with this over the last several Wednesday nights, but it was everything about doctrine, and there was no what? Practice. Nothing about it. And I wanted to say to these guys, this is fine, this stack of papers that you've accumulated, this is great for helping you to get a position, but what are you going to do when you get there? What are you going to encourage people to do when you get there, or are you just going to tell them doctrine? So that actually motivated the statement of faith that I put together, that I did end up sending around to the deacons here, and that I don't know if that went out more broadly than that, but and this is mine. See how thin it is? It's 60 pages. So it is short, and the way I wanted to arrange it, and again, I had it as 14 pages, and the way I wanted to arrange it was to say, listen, let me tell you what I think are the absolute most important important doctrines and things that I just will not compromise on. Absolutely will not compromise on these things. And they were 6 doctrines and 5 practices that I felt, based on studies of church history and everything else, all the things that we've been talking about, these are things that I just think are essential. These are core to who we are as Christians. And then I get into a section, that's a section on essential doctrine. I get into secondary doctrine, more like associational or denominational distinctives. I can't remember. Absolute depravity of man. Now, I believe in the absolute depravity of man. I don't think it's an essential doctrine. I believe it has implications on our salvation, but I'm not going to argue over how depraved human beings are, because even our own tradition of dispensationalism, evangelicalism, is going to have a very wide variety of beliefs, and it's not something I'm going to argue about, but it is interesting. Unlimited atonement, very firm on unlimited atonement, it's a secondary doctrine, so on and so forth. And then I have tertiary doctrines, tertiary third, not as significant. And then I actually also included a list of core beliefs that I thought was, core values rather, not so much essential beliefs and practices, but core values like authentic, Great Commission discipleship making, godly servant leadership, equipping of the saints, this sort of thing. So I really wanted what I was doing to be different. And I've got a lot of really good feedback, especially from people that, search committee chairmen that were very grateful that they didn't have to go through one of these, but also as a way for me to communicate to people that I'm very serious about the distinctive beliefs of our faith. Those are what we need to be proclaiming rather than all the little inflating. So that was really the genesis for our study that we're doing here this evening and for my statement of faith. I wrote this almost exactly the way it is 10 years ago, and except for a little tweaking of a word or two here and there, it's pretty much been the same. And this study, the first doctrine, the most fundamental doctrine, the Trinity, 5 fundamentals of the faith, 5 practices of the faith. That's pretty much the way it's been for me for the last 10 years. And it's very exciting, because that's what I wanted to characterize by, those essential practices and doctrine of the faith. So I gave you a little chart. Did you get the second page? This is page 2. You got the one page last week. At the top of page 2 it says the evangelism of unbelievers. We have some copies if you didn't get one. And then at the bottom of that, I actually have a little chart that kind of pulls together all the things we talked about over the study. The 11 essential doctrines and practices of Christianity. Again, the first is Trinity. The next five are the 5 fundamentals from the early 1900s. And just kind of keep in mind, we're still in that fundamentalistic phase. Yes, we're still benefiting from creedalism and from the Reformation, but we're really still in that fundamentalist phase. Not that we need to be, fundamentalist in the terms that most people think of, the negative terms, but we are still in that phase where there's a tremendous denial of the deity of Christ, the virgin birth, and all these other essentials of the faith. And then 5 significant practices that spring from orthodoxy. Last week we talked about teaching, preaching, teaching the word, discipleship of believers. This week we'll talk about evangelism, refutation of heresy, social implications of the gospel. And here's what you can here's the way you can organize these in your mind. 7 and 8, preaching and teaching, and then discipleship. These are inward. These are things that we as a church do for we as a church. We are teaching, we are growing. These are inward things. The next 2, 9 and 10, evangelism and refutation of heresy, these are what? These are outward. Okay? This is, the first 2 represent our relationship with other believers. The next 2 represent our relationship with unbelievers, basically. We have to be about evangelism, and then, as we'll talk about today, refutation of heresy. And you'll see, hopefully, why that is so important. The 11th one, social implications of the gospel. We'll talk about that, because I know that makes a lot of people's palms sweat, but we'll show you what that means. That is both inward and outward. It is both something we do for ourselves and for others. In fact, you might want to just jot down Galatians 6:10. In fact, let me look it up for us. Because he makes that inward-outward dynamic explicit there in Galatians 6:10. Where he says, so then, and we're not just ripping this out of context, the whole idea of Galatians 5 and 6 is the fruit of the Spirit is the need to you reap what you sow, these kinds of things. But then he says, verse 10, so then while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. So that's an interesting distinction he makes. He says, let's do good for all people. Okay, this is not just let's be nice to ourselves. This is let's do good for all people, but then especially for those of the household of faith, meaning benevolence, meaning meeting of physical needs. The priority is for those of the household of faith first, and then also meeting social needs or material needs outside of that. And we will clarify what I mean by social implication of the gospel. So inward, outward, and then a combination of both of these. And you say, well, what about Godward? Well, that's part of the whole dynamic. You think about all the places. In fact, we're going to look at some of these passages, or some of these are listed, where Jesus says, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you've done for me." Or we'll look at one about evangelism, and it basically says, we spread the glory, we spread the gospel of Christ, and that results in the glory of God. So, and I would just put worship, prayer, all these disciplines of the faith, put those under the category of discipleship of believers. We are growing up in the maturity of Christ, and that is the Godward dimension of that. So last week we talked about preaching, teaching. We talked about evangelism we talked about discipleship of believers. So let's start at the top of the page with evangelism of unbelievers. You're not going to be overwhelmingly surprised that this is an essential and important component of what we do. But just want to remind us that we put discipleship above evangelism. And we did that because discipleship is the goal of evangelism. Evangelism is not an end in and of itself. We don't get people saved and then we're done with them. And we've talked about that many times before. But unfortunately, that is the mentality that permeates modern evangelicalism. Get them saved, and then we're good to go. No, evangelism is a means to the end of discipleship. Conversion is the beginning of the discipleship process, not the end of the process for people. So evangelism is a practice that is demanded of every believer. Luke, Acts 1:8, you're familiar with some of these passages. 1 Peter 2:9. Let's go ahead and turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. I want to look at a couple of these verses here with you. 1 Peter 2, and we're actually going to look at verses 5. I'm sure you're pretty familiar with some of these passages. A couple of things kind of jumped out at me again as I was looking at these passages this afternoon. 1 Peter chapter 2. First Peter chapter 2, verse 5, he says, and you also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Now, what's interesting about that, and there's many things interesting about that, but what's interesting is that he is referring to all believers as a holy priesthood. We understand the priesthood of the believers. This was a foundational tenet to the Reformers, where they were overwhelmed by this heavy church hierarchy. You had your priests and your cardinals and your bishops and your rectors and all the way down, friars. And the Reformers came and said, no, the Bible's pretty clear here. We see this several times in Revelation even, where all believers are referred to as priests. This was, for the first century especially, revolutionary to be called priests, to be in a religion, but for everyone in that religion to be priests. In ancient times, priests always they were in a higher social strata, they were in a higher economic, educational, social category, and they, of course, often used that as a means of condescending upon masses and all the kinds of things that you'd expect suspect they did this during the middle